President Bush did not lash out precipitously at Iraq after 9/11. He did not snub the UN or our allies.
During a speech in his home state of Delaware, Joe Biden claimed that he would be the most progressive candidate in the Democratic primary for 2020. Watch.
I know I get criticized. I'm told I get criticized by the new left. I have the most progressive record of anybody running for the United States, if anybody who would run. I didn't mean it. With anybody who would run.
All right. No. That's just a straight up lie. Complete and total lie. Even if you're a Biden supporter, you know that's not true. But just in case you don't know that, I'm going to break it down. I'm going to compare Joe Biden to who I think is clearly the most progressive candidate in the race, Bernie Sanders. So let's just start off with something easy. And look, for me, this isn't even just about progressive. Throw that word out. Forget who's the most progressive. Who is the most correct? Looking at history, because both Bernie and Joe Biden have an incredibly long history in politics, who has been the most correct on various issues? So let's start with the Defense of Marriage Act and gay rights. So DOMA, which forbids the U.S. government from recognizing same-sex relationships defined by the states, has been a thorn in the side of the gay rights movement since its passage in 1996. As a result of DOMA, people engaged in same-sex marriages receive none of the financial and institutional benefits that the federal government gives to straight married couples, including favorable taxation, various protections, estate tax and gift treatment, as well as a host of other goods and services. And a number of Democrats supported that bill, including, you guessed it, Joe Biden. Now, on top of that, Joe Biden didn't support gay marriage until 2012. And you may remember that because there was a big media hoopla around it because Joe Biden came out in support of gay marriage before Barack Obama did during the 2012 election. So 2012, that was like yesterday. It's incredible. I mean, not even just Joe Biden, but like Hillary Clinton didn't support gay marriage till 2013, and somehow she was supposed to be like a champion of gay rights? Just total bullshit. But you know who actually supported gay marriage far back then and who did not support the Defense of Marriage Act? Bernie Sanders. So this from PolitiFact. NBC's Chuck Todd says Bernie Sanders was there on same-sex marriage 20 years ago. But not only did he vote against the Defense of Marriage Act, he went further. In the early 1970s, Sanders ran for governor of Vermont under the banner of the Liberty Union Party, a coalition of leftist groups. Quote, "The Liberty Union believes that there are entirely too many laws that regulate human behavior," Sanders wrote in an open letter. Quote, "Let us abolish all laws which attempt to impose a particular brand of morality or right on people. Let's abolish all laws dealing with abortion, drugs, sexual behavior, including adultery, homosexuality, etc." And as mayor of Burlington, Vermont, Sanders supported a gay pride parade in 1983, saying we must all be committed to the mutual respect of each other's lifestyle. Sanders also put through a 1984 housing and anti-discrimination ordinance that protected people based on his or her sexual preference. And of course, there was also this clip from 1995.
Is there any shocking doubt? The same people that would vote to cut defense $177 billion, the same ones that would put homos in the military.
Now, my ears may have been playing a trick on me, but I thought I heard the gentleman a moment ago say something, quote unquote, about homos in the military. Was I right in hearing that expression?
Absolutely. Putting homosexuals in the military.
You said something about homos in the military. Was the gentleman referring to the many thousands and thousands of gay people who have put their lives on the line in countless wars defending this country? Was that the group of people that the gentleman was referring to?
I'm talking about the military. People in the military do not support.
That's not what we were talking about. You used the word homos in the military. You have insulted thousands of men and women who have put their lives on the line.
I'm talking about you and liberals like you that keep.
So, I mean, this speaks for itself. whether you look at his votes or whether you look at his actions in the House, Bernie clearly is more progressive and was correct in terms of history. He was on the right side of an issue when it was not popular. Now, let's go to the crime bill. So this one is a little more nuanced because, in fact, Joe Biden and Bernie both voted for the 1994 crime bill, but for very different reasons, which are going to become fairly clear. So before I even play this clip here and this comparison, it's important to note here that Joe Biden crafted the 1994 crime bill. So let me play this. This is Biden and Bernie back to back on their views on the crime bill.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street.
Mr. Chairman, how do we talk about the very serious crime problem in America without mentioning that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world by far, with 22% of our children in poverty and 5 million kids hungry today? Do you think maybe that might have some relationship to crime? How do we talk about crime when this Congress is prepared this year to spend 11 times more for the military than for education? When 21% of our kids drop out of high school, when a recent study told us that twice as many young workers now earn poverty wages as 10 years ago, when the gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider, and when the rate of poverty continues to grow. Do you think maybe that might have some relationship to crime? Mr. Chairman, it is my firm belief that clearly there are people in our society who are horribly violent, who are deeply sick and sociopathic, and clearly these people must be put behind bars in order to protect society from them. But it is also my view that through the neglect of our government and through a grossly irrational set of priorities, we are dooming today tens of millions of young people to a future of bitterness, misery, hopelessness, drugs, crime, and violence.
So, again, it's fairly clear who understood what was going on here. Biden was simply worried about the criminals, and Bernie understood that criminals only exist because of the environment that the U.S. government has created. Now, seeing Bernie here get so, angry about this crime bill, why did he vote for it if he clearly opposes it? Well, the Violence Against Women Act was folded in to the crime bill. So here's Bernie talking about why he is supporting the crime bill.
Mr. Speaker, it is disturbing that the death of Nicole Simpson, a tragedy affecting the rich and the famous, should be necessary to force us to take notice of the horror of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, 80% of homicides in Vermont involve domestic partners or family members. All of the 6 women slain in Vermont during 1993 died at the hands of an intimate partner or a family member. Nationally, 3 out of every 10 women who are victims of homicide were murdered by a spouse or an intimate partner, and every 15 seconds, a woman is battered by her husband or a boyfriend. Mr. Speaker, we have 17 programs in Vermont that work with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, and 92% of the people who provide those services are volunteers. These volunteers, most of whom are women, are doing an extraordinary job in counseling and supporting the victims of domestic violence. But they need help. Mr. Speaker, I have a number of serious problems with the crime bill, but one part of it that I vigorously support is the Violence Against Women Act, We urgently need the $1.8 billion in this bill to combat the epidemic of violence against women on the streets and in the homes of America.
There you go. I mean, it couldn't be any more clear. Biden was on the wrong side of history. Bernie, even though he voted for the crime bill, which you can still take issue with, he voted for it because of the Violence Against Women Act that gave all this money to helping women that are domestically abused. So this is a vote that you can maybe debate and disagree with, but at least you understand that Bernie was on the correct side of history here. Now let's go to something, more obvious, the Iraq War.
Considered in the context of the president's speech this week and his address last month to the United Nations General Assembly, this resolution, though still imperfect, deserves our support, and let me explain why. First, the objective is more clearly and carefully stated. The objective is to compel Iraq to destroy its illegal weapons of mass destruction and its programs to develop and produce missiles and more of those weapons. President Bush did not lash out precipitously at Iraq after 9/11. He did not snub the UN or our allies. He did not dismiss new inspection regimes. He did not ignore Congress. At each pivotal moment, he has chosen a course of moderation and deliberation, and I believe he will continue to do so. At least that is my fervent hope. I wish he would turn down the rhetorical excess in some cases, because I think it undercuts the decision he ends up making. But in each case, in my view, he has made the right, rational, and calm, deliberate decision.
Mr. Speaker, in the brief time I have, let me give you 5 reasons why I'm opposed to giving the President a blank check to launch a unilateral invasion and occupation of Iraq, and why I will vote against this resolution. 1, I have not heard any estimates of how many young American men and women might die in such a war, or how many tens of thousands of women and children in Iraq might also be killed. As a caring nation, we should do everything we can to prevent the horrible suffering that a war will cause. War must be the last recourse in international relations, not the first. Second, I am deeply concerned about the precedent that a unilateral invasion of Iraq could establish in terms of international law and the role of the United Nations. If President Bush believes that the U.S. can go to war at any time against any nation, what moral or legal obligation could our government raise if another country chose to do the same thing? Third, the United States is now involved in a very difficult war against international terrorism, as we learned tragically on September 11th. We are opposed by Osama bin Laden and religious fanatics who are prepared to engage in a kind of warfare that we have never experienced before. I agree with Brent Scowcroft, Republican former National Security Advisor for President George Bush Sr., who stated, and I quote, "An attack on Iraq at this time would seriously jeopardize, if not destroy, the global counterterrorist campaign we have undertaken," end quote. Fourth, at a time when this country has a $6 trillion national debt and a growing deficit, we should be clear that a war and a long-term American occupation of Iraq could be extremely expensive. Fifth, I am concerned about the problems of so-called unintended consequences. Who will govern Iraq when Saddam Hussein is removed? And what role will the U.S. play in an ensuing civil war that could develop in that country? Will moderate governments in the region who have large Islamic fundamentalist populations be overthrown and replaced by extremists? Will the bloody conflict between Israel and the Palestinian Authority be exacerbated? And these are just a few of the questions that remain unanswered.
So this, out of all of these votes, this is maybe the most obvious, where there's the biggest difference. Joe Biden clearly voted for the Iraq War. Bernie voted against it. But not only did Bernie vote against it, Bernie also laid out what happened because of it. Whether it's the amount of money that was spent, whether it was the vacuum that was created when Saddam Hussein was taken out, whether it was, in fact, the rise of terrorism because of that. All of these various scenarios, Bernie laid it all out before it even happened because he was actually knowledgeable and aware of the situation. Joe Biden, once again, proving that he was on the wrong side of history and clearly not the most progressive in this situation either. Now, let's go to an issue of or the issue of civil liberties. So, the Patriot Act, which essentially opened the door for excessive government surveillance. Now, there is a lack of video of Joe Biden talking about this, but let me read this this piece here from BuzzFeed News back in 2015, when there was reporting that Biden might run for president back in 2016. Another potential sticking point for liberals, Biden not only voted for the 2001 Patriot Act, he, on many occasions, claimed credit for writing it. Quote, "I drafted a terrorism bill after the Oklahoma City bombing," Biden was quoted as saying by the New Republic in 2001. "And the bill John Ashcroft sent up was my bill," Biden continued, referring to the Patriot Act. The act broadened the surveillance capabilities of U.S. law enforcement agencies as it relates to identifying potential terrorists, and many of its provisions have been opposed by liberal Democrats and civil libertarians. Now, let me show you a clip of Bernie talking about a potential change to the Patriot Act back in 2005.
This whole discussion about the USA Patriot Act deals with two issues. Number one, every member of this body is pledged to do everything that he or she can to protect the American people from the horrendous scourge of terrorism. But some of us have more confidence in our law enforcement agencies and the American people than others do. We believe that we can fight terrorism, protect the American people without undermining the basic constitutional rights which make us a free country. Let all of us remember that in the 1940s, innocent Japanese Americans, without any pretext, were herded into internment camps. In the 1960s, a president of the United States had a file on him, President Kennedy, by the FBI. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr., who some of us consider to be one of the great heroes of the 20th century, was hounded and investigated by the FBI. The issue today is, how do we effectively fight terrorism, but do it in a way which protects the constitutional rights which make us a free country?
Gentlemen's time.
So, Joe Biden not only supported the Patriot Act, he also took credit for writing it. Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders was consistently fighting against it. There are many videos of Bernie Sanders talking about the Patriot Act. I just pulled one out of there, but you can go and find others. He has been consistent in fighting back against the excessive government surveillance and what the Patriot Act allowed. So, on another issue, Bernie has shown not only was he on the correct side of history, but he was also clearly in the more progressive position on this issue against Joe Biden as well. Now, I'm essentially done here, but I haven't even touched on other topics like Anita Hill or deregulating banks. I mean, that one speaks for itself. Bernie has a whole history of fighting back against deregulation of banks. Meanwhile, Joe Biden actively fights for deregulating banks. So there is just, I don't even know why Biden said this. I mean, it doesn't help. Who is he fooling? He's not fooling progressive voters. His base would be the center. If he ran, and it appears he will be running in the primary, his supporters will be Republican voters and people that are moderate on these issues or conservative on these issues. Biden is not going to get the progressive vote. So I'm not even sure why he has to pretend to be the most progressive in the race when he clearly is nowhere near the most progressive candidate for the 2020 primary.